For a movie titled King Arthur, you'd think it would feature a king named Arthur. You might also expect that this King Arthur would be the film's POV character. And of course he'd be the biggest person on the poster, right? Alas, this is not your typical Arthurian legend movie. It's not really an Arthurian legend movie at all. We'll get into it. I'm Everday, and at the end of this video, I will be grading 2004's King Arthur on its folklorical accuracy. Along the way, we'll learn about dragon-shaped windsocks, Eastern European sword worship, Celtic wild men of the woods, and we'll crack through the ice and get to the bottom of this whole frozen lake situation. Let's take a look. This movie wasn't supposed to be like this. Just ask director Antoine Fuqua. Quote, "When I first signed on to the movie, it was to shoot an R-rated movie, and then halfway through it, that changed. I had to change a lot of my shooting style that I had set up because it just wouldn't have been possible to do certain things and get a PG-13 rating. Tonally, I had a whole different mindset." End quote. And while you can see hints of this different tone in the director's cut of King Arthur, there's still an underlying issue: the script. Screenwriter David Franzoni's previous gig had been a little movie called Gladiator. In fact, he was the one who had conceived of the project after reading a book on the history of the gladiatorial games, Those About to Die by Daniel P. Mannix. And it's clear that Franzoni followed a similar creative blueprint for his, quote, "very cool King Arthur piece, which aims more for history than myth." End quote. That's how Franzoni described his still-in-progress screenplay for King Arthur in 2001. And at this point, he'd already found the history book that would be foundational to his story. C. Scott Littleton and Linda A. Malcor's From Scythia to Camelot, a radical reinterpretation of the legends of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and the Holy Grail. The book attempts to ground Arthurian legend in folklore from the steppes of what are now Ukraine and southern Russia, an area once known as Scythia. And there are two main components to this theory. The first of which, incidentally, involves a major player from the film Gladiator, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. You see, Marcus Aurelius was none too happy that the nomadic Iranian-speaking Sarmatians were taking over Scythia. But as master horse riders, it was easy to understand why. So in the year 175, during the Marcomannic Wars, Aurelius defeated a major Sarmatian tribe known as the the Lazages. But rather than, killing them all, he forced 8,000 Sarmatian cavalrymen to serve in the Roman army. And of these 8,000, 5,500 of them got sent where? Britain. And what was the name of the commander, or one of the commanders anyway, who oversaw a legion of these Sarmatians in Britain? Lucius Artorius Castus. Now, in a vacuum, this name, Artorius, means nothing, because there are thousands of names and words that sort of sound alike but have no etymological connection whatsoever. My favorite example? Shogun and shotgun. So the argument here isn't merely that the name Artorius became anglicized as Arthur, and thus this historical commander clearly inspired the legendary King Arthur. It's also that the culture and traditions of the Sarmatian cavalrymen helped inspire the Knights of the Round Table. The Sarmatians in Britain belonged to heavy cavalry units known as cataphracts. The uniform consisted of head-to-toe armor for man and horse. Their primary weapon, a 12-foot thrusting lance known as a contos. To the local Britons in the 2nd century, these shiny boys certainly would have stood out, and with 5,500 of them coming ashore, it would have made a lasting impression. Or so the argument goes. The icing on the cake? The Sarmatian cataphracts carried wind-inflated military standards known as Draco, plural dracones. They're dragons with their mouths open. And which figure from Arthurian lore has a dragon not only in his heraldry but also in his name? King Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon. It's an intriguing parallel, and I like that the special windsocks show up in the movie, even if they're anachronistic because the filmmakers decided to set the movie not in the 2nd century when Lucius Artorius Castus was actually alive and in Britain, but in the 5th century when Roman presence on the island had dwindled, all so that the knights could battle the invading Saxons like they do in the oldest Arthurian legends. You heard me correctly. Despite Franzoni aiming more for history than myth, the movie still defaults to myth for its time period, which narratively was a smart move, because if 2004's King Arthur had been set in the late 2nd century, when historically Lucius, Artorius, Castus, and the Sarmatians were in Britain, it would have highlighted a potential issue with the Scythia to Camelot hypothesis, which is that Artorius wouldn't have been the good guy defending his country in such a scenario. Historically, he was part of the invading force. A real 2nd century King Arthur, if there ever was such a figure, wouldn't have been a Roman, he would have been a Britonic, aka Brythonic, Celtic-speaking chieftain fighting off the Romans, which the movie sort of gives us with its interpretation of Merlin as a Pictish warlord, more on him later. And it's also insinuated in the movie that Arthur's mother was herself a Pict. So it seems like the filmmakers are trying to have their cake and eat it too, because despite their focus on these Sarmatian knights, Arthur is still a Romano-Britonic warrior who proves himself in battle by defeating the Saxons, which is exactly how he's depicted in the earliest legends. Let us now move on to the second component of the argument set forth in From Scythia to Camelot, which is that mythology originating in the Eastern European steppe directly influenced important Arthurian narratives, including having a hero pull a sword from a stone, tossing a sword into a body of water so a hero can die, and questing for an enchanted drinking vessel. Let's tackle these one at a time. Herodotus tells us that in ancient Scythia, people built a huge square-shaped shrine out of brushwood that had a ramp you could walk up, and at the top was an iron sword. The sword apparently represented a deity, which Herodotus equated with the Greek god of war, Ares. That was in the 400s BCE, and if we flash forward 800 years to the 300s CE, there's still sword stuff going on in the region. To quote the Roman soldier and historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing here in a totally fair and balanced manner about the Alani people, or Alans, quote, "Nor is there any temple or shrine seen in their country, nor even any cabin thatched with straw, their only idea of religion being to plunge a naked sword into the ground with barbaric ceremonies, and then they worship that with great respect as Mars, the presiding deity of the regions over which they wander." End quote. Of course, the missing piece here, the thing that would really help prove that there's a link between Scythian sword worship and the sword in the stone is, you know, the stone. But honestly, learning this does make me rethink the flashback scene in 2004's King Arthur, where a young Arthur pulls a sword not from a stone, but from his father's burial mound. It now seems like that was a direct nod to the Alani practice of ceremonially plunging swords into the ground. Even though in the context of the movie, Arthur's father is Roman, so that doesn't really make sense. Roman soldiers were rarely, if ever, buried with their weapons, and their swords weren't traditionally used as grave markers. Anyway, the more compelling evidence, I think, showing a link between Arthurian and Eastern European steppe legends is the Nart Sagas. These stories were collected in the North Caucasus region of what is now Russia, but it is widely accepted that the roots of many of these stories can be traced back to the Alans and the Sarmatians. In fact, the Ossetians, one of the ethnic groups in the North Caucasus, are direct descendants of the Alans. And in their tellings of the Nart Sagas, one of the major heroes is Batraz, who is said to have skin as hard as steel. Batraz also famously wields a lightning bolt-emitting sword that must be tossed into the Black Sea before he is able to die. This, of course, has a parallel in Arthur instructing his most loyal of knights, Sir Bedivere, to toss Excalibur into a lake so that he, Arthur, may pass on to Avalon. The Nart Sagas also tell of an enchanted drinking vessel, the Wasamanga cup, aka the Narchamanga, which never runs dry. But the vessel will only rise to the lips of those who speak the truth. So yes, there's another obvious parallel here to Arthurian legend, specifically the quest for the Holy Grail and the knights having to pass a purity test to gain access to it. The problem, however, is that both the Lady of the Lake / Excalibur storyline and the Grail Quest storyline originated in medieval France, not Britain. We have the 12th century Frenchmen Chrétien de Troyes and Robert de Boron to thank for those innovations. Ditto the introduction of Sir Lancelot and Sir Galahad, neither of whom appear in the earlier British lore. So assuming Sarmatian cavalrymen brought super early versions of the Nart Sagas or Proto-Nart Sagas with them to Britain in the 2nd century, why didn't their watery sword and enchanted drinking vessel stories enter Arthurian lore there? Why did it happen in France? The authors of From Scythia to Camelot have an answer for this. In the 5th century, the Alans did a big field trip. Nope, that's the wrong word. And they ended up in what is now Brittany, France. The name Lancelot? Yeah, I always assumed he got that name because he used his lance a lot. But according to Littleton and Malcor, the name might have originated as Alanus-à-Lot, meaning Alan of the river Lot. And over time, Alanus-à-Lot became Lancelot. Is it a fun theory? Yes. Does the movie explore this theory at all? No. The film's version of Lancelot turns him into just another Sarmatian. And look, I get that name recognition is the point, and overall the movie does a pretty good job of including the big name Knights of the Round Table. In addition to Clive Owen's Arthur, Ewan Griffith's Lancelot, and Hugh Dancy's Galahad, there's Mad Mickelson's Tristan, Joel Edgerton's Gawain, Ray Winstone's Bors, Ray Stevenson's Dagonet, notably absent, Sirs Bedivere and Percival, also Sir Kay. But why not have a scene where Arthur and those other knights come across Lancelot and Galahad in the woods somewhere? And maybe you do a little homage to the 1981 movie Excalibur and have Arthur and Lancelot fight. And then they all become friends, and when they ask the brave knight his name, he says in a French accent, Alanus-à-Lot. And Bors is like, alright then, Lancelot. And scene. As for the Woads, they're meant to be Picts, the native Brittonic/Brythonic Celtic speakers of northern and eastern Scotland. Not to be confused with the Goidelic/Gaelic Celtic speakers of western Scotland who came over from Ireland. The term Woad here refers to the blue war paint the Picts did historically wear, and you bet your butt the Picts did indeed fight the Romans. And the Picts also fought the Saxons. But at no point, as far as I can tell, did the Picts ever team up with Roman cavalrymen and fight the Saxons together. Meanwhile, while Merlin, played here by Stephen Delane, is traditionally associated with the legendary Welsh bard Merlin Wilt, or Merlin the Wild, the movie transports him across Hadrian's Wall to Scotland, which does have a folkloric precedent, it turns out, because according to the Annals Cambriae, a distraught Merlin fled the Battle of Arthurdurth in 573 CE, taking up residence in Scotland's Caledonian forest, where he communed with nature and gained the gift of prophecy. While the inclusion of the date here certainly gives this account an air of historicity, this is actually an example of the Celtic wild man of the woods motif, a folklore motif that may have originated in Scotland with an earlier wild man, Lailoken. Origins aside, by putting Merlin on the other side of the battlefield from Arthur for most of the movie, Arthur loses a critical advisor, because in the legends, that's Merlin's primary role. He's not just doing magic, he's helping Arthur make good decisions. The movie fills this advisatory gap with Pelagius, a Christian theologian from Britain who, historically, was active between 390 and 418 CE. Which sort of makes sense for this film's mashed up timeline, because most of the action is set in 467 after Pelagius is dead, but then again, the historical Artorius preceded Pelagius by 200 plus years, so none of it really makes any sense. And while we could get into the weeds as to whether Artorius is interpreting Pelagius's work correctly, let's just take it at face value that the main point here is freedom. People should be free. Which is why in the final seconds of this film, everyone kneels down before Arthur, and presumably he becomes their king. Yay, freedom! As for the film's blue-hued beauty, Keira Knightley's Pictish warrior Guinevere, there's a Middle Welsh poem known as the Apple Tree Stanzas, which alludes to Merlin the Wild having a sister, who is a prophet in her own right. And this powerful woman's name is Gwenddydd. In the original Welsh form of the name Guinevere was Gwenvar. No, not the same. But both have the same Brythonic Celtic root, Gwen, meaning white. As for the love triangle between Guinevere, Arthur, and Lancelot, which is central to the Lancelot-Grail cycle, the movie reduces this to a few lustful looks on Lancelot's part. Then, Lancelot dies. Finally, the internet is unanimous that for all of its flaws, 2004's King Arthur is able to redeem itself with that frozen lake battle scene. It demonstrates actual strategy on the part of the Knights of the Round Table, who forced the invading Saxons, including Stellan Skarsgård's Cerdic and Till Schweiger's Kinrick, toward the center of the lake, clustering them together. It's possible screenwriter David Franzoni drew inspiration from the historical Battle on the Ice, during which a prince clashed with a bunch of crusaders on a frozen lake. Historically and archaeologically speaking, the ice never broke during that battle, but in later retellings you better believe there were shiny boys splish-splashing everywhere. Also, it's probably worth noting that the aforementioned battle on the ice took place in 1242 on Lake Peipus, which forms part of the border between modern-day Estonia and Russia, so it has no connection to Arthurian lore whatsoever. Still a good story, though. In his Divine Comedy, specifically in the Inferno, Dante talks about the frozen lake of Castus. It's the 9th and lowest circle of hell, where people perpetually drown and congeal, I guess, in a freezing lake. But presuming the filmmakers took at least some inspiration from the landscapes they knew they would be filming in, the wild places of Ireland, England, and Wales, maybe they learned about the legend associated with the Welsh Llangors Lake, aka Llyn Scythian, which, according to the late 12th/early 13th century historian Gerald of Wales, was celebrated for its miracles. And I quote, "The lake is sometimes seen by the inhabitants covered and adorned with buildings, pastures, gardens, and orchards. In the winter, when it is frozen over and the surface of the water is converted into a shell of ice, it emits a horrible sound, resembling the moans of many animals collected together." End quote. As someone who grew up ice fishing in the wild places of Massachusetts, let me tell you, it doesn't matter which lake or pond you're on, the ice is always talking to you. And Gerald correctly concludes that there is a natural explanation for the noises. He then goes on to describe the nearby mountains, which include, quote, the Cader, Arthur, or the Chair of Arthur, so called from two peaks rising up in the form of a chair, and which from its lofty situation is vulgarly ascribed to Arthur, the most distinguished king of the Britons. End quote. New theory. Screenwriter David Franzoni wasn't just reading from Scythia to Camelot when he wrote this movie, he was reading the itinerary and description of Wales, first published in 1191. As for its folklorical accuracy grade, I'm giving 2004's King Arthur a C-. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. Wherever I go on this wretched island, I hear your name. As always, I'm I.E. Neverday. I've got books for sale in the description. Thanks for coming out.